April Doss. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute of Technology, Law and Policy, housed at the Georgetown University Law Center. And I'm absolutely delighted that we are co-sponsoring with the Wikimedia Foundation this discussion of an event that for some will be well remembered and for others might be new information. If you had tried to log on 10 years ago to the internet, you would have found a number of websites down. Why? All in protest of two bills being considered before Congress to address online piracy, to address intellectual property. And this led to a really extraordinary set of actions, both online and offline, and in-person protests geared at influencing the scope of discussion around regulating the internet. Here we are 10 years in the future, once again, faced with questions relating to the regulation of the internet, how and if and in what manner it might be regulated, and how to balance all the competing interests that involves. We have an extraordinary lineup of discussants here for this presentation. So I will not take any further time. I want to turn the conversation over to my colleague, Anupam Chander, who is the Scott Ginsberg Professor of Law and Technology here at Georgetown Law School. And Anupam, over to you for this conversation on regulating the internet 10 years after the SOPA PIPA Blackout.
Thanks so much, April. On January 18th, 2012, 10 years ago, the internet went dark. To dramatize the perceived risks from a bill making its way through Congress, Google slapped a black band across its logo, visually recalling the censorship of an analog age, while other sites like Wikipedia blacked out their sites entirely. Proponents argue that the SOPA PIPA bills were necessary to combat foreign websites that facilitate infringement of US copyright. But the bill defined, quote, US directed sites, unquote, to include sites inside the United States. Such a site could be declared, quote, dedicated to theft of US property if there were a, quote, high probability that it could be used to carry out IP infringement. Given that almost any site with user-generated content will include, inevitably, copyright infringing work, even ordinary sites might then be declared rogue. The protest worked, and within a week, Congress had shelved the bill. So I'm thrilled today that we have a leader of that extraordinary concerted action, Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia. Jimmy founded Wikipedia in 2001, and I should note that in researching his bio, I began where I always begin in my research, Wikipedia. So let's turn to our conversation with Jimmy Wales. Before, so we'll have a conversation with Jimmy, and then later on, we'll come back to all the other great panelists that we have lined up here. So Jimmy, Wikipedia was one of the key players in the SOPA PIPA debates. Announcing the blackout, you advised students to do their research early, and you called on Wikipedia users to melt phone lines on Capitol Hill. What was at stake? What lessons do you think the blackout has to offer today?
So, I think you did a good job of describing the bill and sort of the major concerns about it. And this is all part of, I would say, an ongoing, even since then, even down to today, battle over internet freedom, the ability of ordinary people to use the internet in ways that they would expect that they can, and the ability for sites to host them without taking on undue legal risk. And that takes many forms. And obviously, SOPA PIPA was quite bad, hence the strong reaction. So, I feel like the result was, and the lesson from it was pretty remarkable. One of the things about copyright is that it is very often portrayed as somehow, it's Silicon Valley versus Hollywood, an industrial dispute between sort of the movie and music industries versus Silicon Valley companies. And I think that really fundamentally misses a really big chunk of what the whole copyright debate should be about. We should be thinking about things like ordinary users who are just trying to use the internet to share ideas and thoughts, We need to think about small creators. Obviously, I'm not a rabid anti-copyright person, but small creators who find it quite difficult sometimes to monetize their content in a world of sort of infinite piracy. So these are tough issues. And as we begin to think about, okay, starting from our current state of affairs, what might we do to improve things? Well, unfortunately, heavy-handed legislation could actually kill fantastic places on the internet, things like Wikipedia, but also what people often forget is there's a lot of really great small websites that are community-based websites. I mean, one of my favorite examples that I know of, who were very worried about SOPA PIPA, is a website devoted to Lord of the Rings. So it's basically Lord of the Rings message board, chat board. They talk about the books, they talk about the movies. Obviously, people post pictures from the movies, which is absolutely fair use. They post memes but the owners of that website are just hobbyists, right? It's not a charity, right? It's not a non-commercial website. They've got a few ads to cover their hosting costs. They're not making a living out of it. It's a small community, and they would have to shut down. Actually, what they would probably have to do is say, we can't host our own website anymore. We need to move everything to a Facebook group and let Facebook deal with the legal risk. So we need to think about those elements as well. How can small startups, small communities, or individuals hosting groups and websites be able to be independent, not depend on going under the umbrella of a large company which has the legal resources to fight against sort of nonsense lawsuits?
That's really an important way to reframe the debate between, rather than Hollywood versus Silicon Valley, Northern California versus Southern California, as I like to often portray it, the actual kind of small users, the ordinary users and the ordinary creators, and who are using the internet, and we need to kind of make sure that the laws work for them. Now, we've seen across the world, Jimmy, from China to Europe to the United States, it seems every day there's a new law or major enforcement action with respect to the internet. What worries you most about internet regulation? What might justify a similar blackout today?
So I would say there are a couple of things that I would focus on. One, just in general, the rise of more and more legislation in more and more places around the world, which purports to be applicable globally, which necessarily involves a balkanization, the internet being divided into regions or areas in a very problematic way. So let me give one example of that. I live in London. I used to say I live in Europe. After Brexit, I'm not sure what I call it anymore. But I live in London. And my mother lives in Alabama, and she sent me a link on WhatsApp, as moms tend to do, of a news story from Decatur, Alabama, which is a small town near where she lives. I click on the link, and guess what? I can't read that newspaper. The reason is GDPR. Now, GDPR is a privacy regulation. It has a lot of positive merits to it. But one of the downsides of GDPR is that it purports to apply globally. A lot of newspapers in the US, including larger organizations like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the biggest newspaper in Atlanta, have chosen, probably for simple economic reasons, that it's just not worth the risk to show their website to people in Europe. And they probably do that not because they're desperately trying to improperly exploit the data of people in Europe. It's because almost no one from Europe reads the Decatur daily newspaper, and it's just not worth it. And they look into how they could comply, and it's complicated and hard. And they just say, yeah, no, we're gonna opt out of that. My first answer is, the rise of legislation that purports to apply across borders, which gives rise to people, sort of deciding not to serve in a global sense. The other, of course, is we've got to talk about Section 230. There's just a steady drumbeat about Section 230 and some kind of reform of Section 230. And, there are almost, I'm going to take a very strong position. There are almost no good ideas about how to reform Section 230. There's a lot of bad ideas. And what is interesting about it is that from all sides of the political spectrum, people like to sort of impose their fantasy of the outcome they're going to get from it. And so, if Twitter becomes liable for all the content on the platform, then X will happen. And X is, all the content that I like will be allowed through, and everything I don't will not be allowed through. And so we can think about that in terms of, if you are deeply concerned about vaccine misinformation, COVID misinformation, which in the US means you probably tend to be on the left. I mean, that's obviously a nonpartisan issue, but let's just say, you might say, oh, it'd be great if we got rid of all of these sort of right-wing anti-vax people. And, if you're on the other side, you've got a whole different set of concerns of things you think that they should be doing or not be doing, or they should lose protection if they ban your wonderful information about coronavirus vaccines and the problems they cause. So, so everybody's got their fantasy about what it means. And my concern is that legislatures don't tend to be particularly nuanced. And when you've got a broad coalition of people sort of fantasizing about what a post Section 230 internet might look like, well, they can end up doing something kind of stupid. And I think none of us want that. I mean, and again, I think we can begin to start to reframe this debate by recognizing, like, a big part of what's going on is people are really, really pissed off at Facebook and the other internet giants in a way. And they're pissed off because Facebook allows all kinds of nonsense, or they're pissed off because Facebook has banned their particular favorite nonsense or whatever, and they make a ton of money, right? And that makes them a very easy target. And in fact, a lot of the rhetoric around Section 230 goes something like this: like, they've got this improper sort of safe harbor that allows them to monetize like crazy, and they're not liable for anything, and that's not fair. Therefore, we should rein them in. And realistically, if you say, well, look, if I have a problem that Facebook or Google or whoever is making too much money, okay, that's a public policy decision. We can talk about that. But probably Section 230, in my view, isn't the right place to be looking, right? It's sort of, let's think about antitrust, particularly in where the real money issues are, which is around the advertising marketplace and the control of that. Look at antitrust in the sense of how do the app stores operate, and what is my right to install software that I bought from someone else on my devices. Those are the kinds of issues that are interesting. I'm not taking a position on those, but those are where the money comes in. Section 230 is really not what makes it profitable to be Facebook. And indeed, we see that Facebook, I have no idea what their proposals are. I apologize that I haven't studied it closely enough. But Facebook seems quite amenable to making some amendments to Section 230. And my slightly skeptical view is that maybe it's because of all of those independent message boards that aren't on Facebook might say, actually, we can't afford to take the risk. We're going to have to move to Facebook, and Facebook will have a system for dealing with it. And we're all the poorer for it, I think.
So all of that resonates deeply with me. So when you say you don't know what Facebook is proposing in terms of tech regulation that it supports, you're not alone, because Facebook hasn't made it clear what exactly is the Section 230 regulation that it wants, the reform that it wants. I think Facebook is confident that whatever Section 230 reform passes through Congress is one that it can live with, and that others, its competitors, cannot live with, and hopefully taking the heat off of Facebook in that way. So I totally agree with you that that is a real concern. Now, and I also worry that there's this sense here that, if we reform 230, it fixes the internet in particular ways, in the way that I want it fixed. And there is no magic wand to fixing the internet. That's my base. I teach internet law, and I have for the last 20 years. There's no single solution. And so there is a kind of effort to say that this will fix the internet. And I worry in this context of Section 230, you talked about liability for, bad things on Twitter. It leads to what I think of as a kind of Disneyfication. Do we want the internet to look like Disneyland. There was a question posed by a Meta person recently about whether or not the metaverse would look like Disneyland. And I think that would be a real problem if we made the metaverse look like Disneyland. There might be a Disneyland metaverse, but I don't want that to be the only metaverse that the law makes available, right? So let's keep on. I should also mention to the audience that we do welcome your questions and to Jimmy and to the other panelists later. So please queue them up, and I'm going to ask Jimmy a couple more questions, but after that, we want to come back to you. Now, so do you think a civil society tech company alliance is possible today? That was what happened in 2012. What do you think, we should be thinking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I think that there are plenty of shared interests of both the internet community and of the big commercial internet giants. It may be very beneficial to YouTube's business model that I can take a nice video of myself doing something silly, or TikTok silly with I don't know, they're always flipping bottles of water or whatever. It's great for their business model. It's also great for me, right? It's like I can post stuff and I can get an audience and I can have fun doing it and I can show things to my friends and family. So there's a lot of alignment around this. And when we think about certain types of reforms of Section 230, which basically will put barriers and difficulties around user-generated content, that's not really in anybody's interest. And I think for Wikipedia, for example, I think because we are very different from other platforms, and not just in our business model, i.e. we're a charity trying to provide a bit of public service and a public infrastructure, but also in the way we do things, the way we're organized, that I think we as internet users would actually benefit greatly if some of the ideas around content moderation used by Wikipedia became more common around the internet. And if we have, so the way I describe this is, most people who are looking at Section 230 internet regulation, sort of not necessarily experts in the field, but sort of newspaper columnists and things like that, they really have blinders on. They think the only real model is, here's the company, they own the platform. I call it a feudal model, sort of master and serf on the estate. And the company makes all the rules and they enforce the rules, and they've got mysterious moderators who are basically unaccountable in many ways. And users might get blocked or banned if they do the wrong thing, et cetera, et cetera. And that model, you think, okay, how can we improve that? And you start thinking about, okay, well, maybe we'll force the companies to do it this way, or we'll force this and that and the other. But you can very easily then trip up on not understanding that Wikipedia doesn't work anything like that at all. All of the content moderation I would argue all of the content moderation flows from the authority and the power of the community. The Wikimedia Foundation gets involved only in very, very minimal ways, and not against the community, but to deal with issues that are tricky for our community to deal with. So for example, a simple example would be, if somebody is coming onto the site and disrupting across 75 different languages, and we're organized by languages, it's not really easy for the English Wikipedia administrators and the German Wikipedia administrators to help, and Hungarian and Finnish and everywhere. That kind of requires a global response, and that's something that the Wikimedia Foundation would facilitate. There are other examples, if we don't allow for people to come on the platform and advocate for pedophilia. That's just not okay. It's not the right thing to do in our community. But it's really hard to have a public debate. Like if you come on and you start pushing an agenda and we want to have a debate, it's like Anupam, he's basically, all he's doing is pushing an agenda in favor of his favorite politician. And he won't listen to reason. And we've had many discussions of debate. We think actually he probably just needs to be banned from editing in that particular area because he's not really doing a good job. It's really hard to to sort of have a public debate about whether or not you're a pedophile. Like, that's just not something we should do. It's just better if that's handled, by trust and security people and so on. There are other examples, right? So suicide threats, harm, things like that. But in general, our core model is really not that, if you see a headline that says Wikipedia bans, this, or Wikipedia takes this political position, as if we're Twitter or Facebook, it's like, you're kind of missing the point. The Wikimedia Foundation doesn't have anything to do with that, right? It's community, open dialogue, debate, discussion, which anybody can join. And so that model is not one that's typically contemplated by most internet sort of ideas about regulating how moderation is done. And it would be very easy to write a regulation that suddenly requires the Wikimedia Foundation to hire 150 people to moderate the site, which would kill the spirit and the meaning of what Wikipedia is about. So we want to be very careful about that.
So let me turn to one of the audience questions, and we have Carl Melamud on the call here, asking a question for Jimmy. How did that fairly amazing coming together of the whole community happen on the SOPA protest? Do you think it could happen again?
Yeah, I do think it could happen again. So how it came about historically, it's all a little fuzzy in my aging brain at this point. We had seen before this a couple of successful protests, one in Italy, for example, where the Italians blacked out the site, and Italy backed down. I don't remember exactly what that was about. It was really more about a right of reply type of thing or something like that. Anyway, and I commented to the community. I doubt if I'm the first person to comment. Should we consider a blackout? And then suddenly there was a huge discussion. It took a few days, and actually at that time, what was really interesting is we were hearing from Washington, this has broad bipartisan support, and there's basically no way to stop it. It's going to happen. Maybe we can get some provisions to help out or whatever. And so we just thought, and so actually one of the things that happened, it was just before Christmas. There was meant to be a vote. A couple of good sort of allies of the internet, I would say, but a couple of senators, delayed it, which gave us enough time. They didn't delay it in order to give us enough time. They had no idea what we were doing, but it got delayed until January, which meant there was time for the community to really discuss and decide. And of course, Wikipedians be Wikipedians. There was a huge amount of reading the bill and policy analysis and debate and discussion. And there was in the end, there was a vote. And the vote was significantly in the majority. And so it was decided that we would black out English Wikipedia for that day. So yeah, it was exciting. So another example where we almost came to this, where I personally thought we should have, was in Europe, the new European Copyright Directive, which is sort of even now just being implemented and is very problematic in lots of ways. And again, we were told it's too late. There's no way you're going to win. Community wasn't sure. We didn't quite do it, and we lost by one vote. Which I'm pretty sure we could have changed at least one person's mind if they saw that the Wikipedians were upset. Because again, we're not neither Silicon Valley nor Hollywood, right? When people understand, like, if the Wikipedians are upset, well, we should listen, because they've given this amazing gift of an encyclopedia, and they're not bad people. What's going on here? We wouldn't want to break Wikipedia. And so I think we should. I think around Section 230 is probably, if I had to forecast, and there's no plans in the community. There's no, these things will happen as they unfold. I mean, as of right now, the idea of some sort of change to Section 230 is still just, vaporware, as we would call it. But as it begins to take shape, I trust me, the community will be watching very, very carefully. And I think it's entirely possible that they might decide, yeah, this is something we need to campaign about.
Well, that comes to a great question posed by Daniel Castro. We have a illustrious group of people who are watching and joining this conversation here. The blackout was driven by popular websites like Google and Reddit. There have been countless hearings over the past few years about how large online platforms manipulate public opinion, quote unquote. If tech companies today tried to mobilize users to oppose congressional legislation that targeted them, for example, 230, as you've mentioned, do you think they'd still be successful, or would they be villainized for using their market power?
I mean, it's a very good question. Certainly, I would say it has become more difficult in the past 10 years for the big internet companies to have a say in public policy, because they've been rightly or wrongly, in many cases rightly, villainized for various bad behavior. So, for example, it's very hard for anybody to take Facebook seriously on questions about privacy post Cambridge Analytica. And so that's, you know, for better or worse, that's where we are, right? That it is harder. I mean, what is interesting, and I wish I had the quote, I quickly tried to Google it, but I can't find it. But, you know, there was some grumblings after we did the blackout that it was an abuse of power for us to have done that. And there was a suggestion by one lobbyist that he had written a lot of checks and nobody was listening to him. It's abuse of power that Wikipedia has done this. And I said, you know, getting millions of ordinary people riled up about public policy is not an abuse of power. That's called democracy. And that's really important. I think it's easier for us to do that, to say that, simply because of who we are, and also because I would say we have been principled for a very, very long time in how we go about things. So when we speak on issues of censorship in China, for example, we do so from a perspective that people can respect. We've always said we will never cooperate with censorship, we'll never give in. We're happy to have discussions with anybody about whatever issues or problems they have. And in Turkey, we fought in the courts, and we fought all the way to the Supreme Court in Turkey and won, and Wikipedia was banned in Turkey and now is not banned in Turkey, which I'm very proud of. And so because of that, I think it's a lot easier for us to say, look, here's what we believe in, here's why we believe in it. We've always said that. It's not suddenly we found a commercial reason to care about the public's freedom of expression. It's always been who we are.
So the last question for you, Jimmy, I wanted to ask you, 10 years ago, there was a lot more hope about the role of the internet in society. There was something that we really deeply wanted to protect. But today, the focus seems more on the internet's dark side. What makes you want to defend the internet today?
Well, one of the things I always say about myself is that I'm a pathological optimist. So I always think everything's going to be great. And I'm still very much that, you know, I think I've always been a realistic person, but I'm a realistic tech utopian. I still see the incredible value that the internet has and has had. And I view a lot of the attacks on the internet as really, really inappropriate pushback from people whose power base is being threatened. So if I hear a newspaper baron lament, you know, that people are talking to each other, this is the way I hear it, whatever they may be saying, it's terrible that people are talking to each other and listening to politicians directly without us filtering that for them and telling them what to think. I'm like, yeah, I can see why that might upset you, you know, that you know, democracy, you know, might not be so comfortable to somebody who's had a cozy position for decades. Similarly, you know, I find that a lot of people in the movie industry and the music industry who are rightly concerned about piracy, I think I should say that clearly, but in the process, they don't actually really care that much about people's freedom of expression. And if you say Disneyfication of the internet, they might have a little pause if they don't work for Disney per se, but if they really understand what you mean by that, they'd be like, actually, that sounds fine, right? If all of the big companies, you know, could actually just put out good quality content that people are willing to pay for, that would be great. And actually, all this other stuff is horrible and vile, and who cares anyway? And I just think, you know, I think that, you know, even let's just say, I've discussed how the public has villainized Facebook and in my view, rightly for certain things. And yet I also really still appreciate, like, all of my high school friends, I still stay in touch with, and I kind of stay in touch with them through Facebook, and they, or Instagram these days. They post pictures of their kids and their vacations, and that's actually meaningful. It's easy to sort of laugh that stuff off, but it's like, actually, it's real, genuine human connections with people, and that's actually really, really valuable. So there we are.
Thank you very much for joining us on this occasion, Jimmy. We really appreciate your great support for all of us as researchers, as teachers, as students. You could have said 10 years ago, hey, teachers, do your research early, because it's going to be shut down in a couple of days. I would have appreciated that warning as well. So I rely upon Wikipedia all the time. And so thank you for the great gift you've given to the world. And thanks for joining us. Yeah,
I heard a great joke the other day. A teenager comes in, says to his father, "Dad, I'm sorry, I got arrested, but don't worry, it's okay." So, "Oh, what'd you get arrested for?" "Well, I got arrested for downloading all of Wikipedia, but it was okay. I could explain everything."
I like it. I love it. Love it.
It's a bad joke.
And you can download it all. That's the amazing thing. It's all legal. Thank you again.
Great.
So let's turn to our amazing panel that we have to follow on that amazing conversation. So let me begin with Ali Funk. Ali has been researching the state of the global internet. So she spent the last year producing an immensely important report on net freedom across the world. And the report is titled The Global Drive to Control Big Tech. She is a researcher at Freedom House and a co-author of that report. Ali, your comprehensive study of internet freedom worldwide is pretty gloomy. Things are getting worse for internet freedom from China to the US. Can you give us your takeaways and some examples?
Yeah, happy to. First, thanks everyone for having me. Really excited to be here on this important anniversary. Just a quick summary of Freedom House for those who don't know us. We're an independent organization founded in 1941 to defend and expand democracy around the world. Freedom on the Net, we've been doing for over a decade now. We cover 70 countries around the world. It's about 88% of the world's internet population, so we can get a really holistic look of how internet freedom is unfortunately declining. So we released the report back in September. We found that internet freedom declined for the 11th year in a row. So every year we've done the report, it's declined. It's been gloomier each year. I'm still waiting for the day I can say it improved. 2022 doesn't look much better, but so we detailed this high stakes battle between governments and tech companies around the world, and really how the human rights of internet users are the ones paying the price here. So a growing number of governments are now asserting their authority over the private sector. And it's really this laissez-faire approach to the tech industry over the past decade created opportunities for authoritarian manipulation of platforms, data exploitation, or widespread malfeasance. So in the absence of a shared and global vision for a free and open internet, governments have adopted their own approaches to policing the digital sphere. So what we did is we went through all 70 countries that we cover, and we found that authorities in at least 48 of them pursued new rules for tech companies around online content, personal data, or competition over the past year. And some of those reflected sort of legitimate attempts to mitigate online harms, to rein in misuse of data or end manipulative market practices. But we found that many new laws or investigations simply require companies to remove broad categories of speech without effective safeguards. So these sort of provisions make it easier for political leaders to just censor political dissent, investigative reporting, or people who are just simply expressing their religious or gender identity. Other news laws just undermine encryption and impose broad data collection requirements on the private sector, making government surveillance easier. One example, I think, of a law that we really focus in on that I find deeply concerning has to do with India's information technology rules, which were one of the world's most comprehensive regulatory initiatives over the past year. So the laws, require large social media companies, so what you think of big tech, to police content for material that undermines public order, morality, that would violate the country's sovereignty. It also would hold certain company employees criminally liable if they don't comply with censorship orders. And then it also requires, large social media companies to undermine end-to-end encryption as well. So, we're concerned that this sort of global drive to control big tech is, being wielded for government's own political purposes instead of curbing and decentralizing the power of tech companies. And, going back to why a free and open internet is so important, so much of the internet is really, about its egalitarian nature. So ideally, wherever you are, whoever you are, you have the world of knowledge at your fingertips. But all this regulatory action is sort of happening at a time of a historic crackdown on free expression and privacy. And just some, I think, really alarming data points from our report was that in at least 56 countries over the past year, officials arrested or convicted people for nonviolent speech online. That's a record high of any sort of year we've done the report. Governments are suspending internet access in more countries than ever before. Social media platforms are being blocked by government authorities, often during protests or elections. And then we've also seen an increase of surveillance. So, we found that authorities in at least 45 countries are suspected to have access to, sophisticated spyware or data extraction technology. So in conclusion, we closed the report calling for governments and private sector about how they can shore up internet freedom. We think now is the time for really smart, and the key here is narrowly tailored internet regulations that protect users and empower free expression, the global exchange of information, and ensure that, power does not accumulate in the hands of a few dominant actors, whether that's the state or the private sector. And we outline some ways to do that. We think about how can competition policy, foster personalization, interoperability. How can data privacy laws protect against government and corporate surveillance, but not fragment the internet more and more as we're seeing. And then we also call for regulators to focus on things like transparency and really ensure strong protections against intermediary liability.
Great. So thank you, Ali. Those are all incredibly valuable suggestions for how to frame laws and that might promote a open and global internet. Konstantinos Komaitis, I want to turn to you. He is currently an internet policy consultant and was until recently senior director of policy strategy and development of the Internet Society. 10 years ago, Konstantinos, you were in Glasgow and then Geneva working against SOPA. And this reminds me of what Jimmy just said about the kind of global nature of some of these laws, the fact that they have this kind of spillover effect across the world. What were your concerns then? And what does that tell us about the global nature of national internet laws today?
Thank you very much, Anupam. Hello, everyone. I am super excited to be here, and thank you very much for having me. So that's right. I remember at the time I was teaching at the law school at a university in Glasgow, and I was also chairing the civil society group within ICANN, that's the International Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And there was a lot of activity and movement. I was in my early days of working on these issues, and it really felt as if there was a movement happening, and I was joining a community of people that we were all fighting for the same cause, and that was, of course, saving the internet and our ability to express ourselves online. But if there is really one thing that I am still remembering from those days is really the amount of collaboration and coordination that took place. And it sort of, at least from where I was sitting, felt that it was happening very organically. And in reflecting about it, I really think that there was a good reason for it, right? SOPA was a US legislation, and in theory, it shouldn't really matter or affect any of us outside of the United States. However, I think one of the things that we sort of understood early on was that the debate about SOPA was not just a US issue. It was not just about intellectual property. It was really about the internet. It was really about how some legislation was about to undermine some of the basic architectural designs of the internet, and how that could affect the way we as users would end up experiencing it. So, and I think that is an important detail, and I hope that we will discuss a little bit a bit later, because unlike Ginny, I don't feel that currently we are at a stage where we would see this coordination, or we are seeing this coordination. In terms of concerns, and I will finish with that, they were really ranging at the time. Of course, they had to do with the way SOPA was designed and the way that it would really impact, the DNS in the specific case, because it was about DNS filtering. But there was another point that really concerned me, and that was what sort of an example it would pave for other jurisdictions outside of the United States that were seeing a country that really gave us Section 230 going into the process of actually using the internet and using the technology in order to regulate something to the detriment of both the technology and users. And I think that 10 years later, it's pretty clear that the ideas that SOPA has given around the world are not that great.
Great, thanks, Konstantinos. Those are all, it's incredible to just think about the fact that you were trying to kind of organize across the world with respect to what's happening in Washington, DC. So let's turn to Rebecca McKinnon. Rebecca is one of my oldest friends in this area. Rebecca is Vice President of Global Advocacy at the Wikimedia Foundation. A decade ago, she published an important book that I still think is great reading, Consent of the Networked, where she warned about the growing danger of digital authoritarianism. I was proud to host one of her first book launch events. Can you take us back to what you were thinking 10 years ago, and then what you're worried about today?
Well, thank you, Anupam, and thanks for the plug of my 10-year-old book that came out 10 years ago, February 1st. So coinciding with the SOPA PIPA anniversary pretty closely. But the point is that history is just strewn with the wreckage of overcorrection, right? And I think that's where we are now. 10 years ago, when I wrote my book, I was reacting to excessive optimism and what I felt was completely rose-colored glasses on the part of policymakers, on the part of civil society broadly, the media, and that really benefited, of course, the technology companies, that all you need is Facebook and Twitter and Google, and democracy will flourish. That was the conventional wisdom. Believe it, remember those days? Twitter revolutions, Facebook revolutions. That's all you needed was to give Facebook and Twitter to the masses around the world, and everyone would be free. And of course, it hasn't turned out that way. And at the time when I warned, my warning was that actually, if we don't all take responsibility for how technology is governed, operated, and designed, then it's not automatically going to turn out well for democracy and human rights. And the book was not a bestseller, and perhaps I could take a I told you so tour. But the point is now is that we're overcorrecting. That policymakers are overcorrecting, that the media narratives are overcorrecting, and all we need to do is punish big tech, and somehow recreate some fantasy that never existed, and all will will save democracy in the process. And that is, of course, hogwash, as much as 10 years ago we had hogwash. And so we need to, what we really need now is for policymakers, but for society at large, for our discourse to shift, for our framing to shift. And yes, there are a lot of problems we need to address. There's a lot of irresponsibility and abuses of power that have been taking place. And as Ali's comments made clear, not just by companies, but also by governments, using punishing big tech as an excuse. But we need to reframe this less about how do we punish bad behavior, which obviously needs to be held accountable, but what kind of internet do we want? And what kind of regulatory legal approaches and frameworks are going to give us the internet that is going to help open societies flourish and serve the public interest. And one of the reasons I'm so excited to be with the Wikimedia Foundation and to be working with Jimmy so closely now is that I truly believe that what's good for the Wikimedia movement and for Wikipedia serves the public interest. It's something of a proxy, although it's also going to protect broader, what I like to call digital civil society, digital civic space. And we need to make sure that people not only have free speech protections to speak out online, to report facts, to share knowledge online, but to also build, operate, and govern their own free knowledge communities, their own journalistic communities. I also co-founded nearly 20 years ago a citizen journalism community. And we need the legal frameworks that will enable that, free scholarship, and enable scholars to govern their own platforms for sharing of scholarship. Librarians, et cetera. We need the legal frameworks that enable communities to build the knowledge and information frameworks that actually serve them, and that they can design and govern to fit their contexts. And speaking of overcorrection that Jimmy was talking about quite a bit, the Section 230 reform, most of the Section 230 reform proposals are examples of overcorrections, in which people are seeking to solve problems, but not thinking about how do we actually proactively protect civic space and the right, not only free speech, but self-governance of information communities, of online communities. And I would point to a very concrete example, and I published a Medium article today that gets into this, and Clive Thompson, former New York Times journalist, published something on Medium yesterday that kind of unpacks the same thing. Look at COVID-19 information and how the Wikipedia community has been governing the production and sharing of COVID-19 information to ensure that pages across multiple languages are high quality and are citing peer-reviewed scientific sources. And there's recently a couple of academic papers that have actually documented the high quality of COVID-19 information across Wikipedia. And that, of course, contrasts rather starkly with the quality of COVID-19 information on commercial websites, the names of which are well familiar, and the concerns about the amplification and targeting of misinformation and spread of misinformation on sites that have fundamentally different kind of business models, shall we say. So the point being is, how do you encourage more communities to self-govern in ways that produce high quality public interest information and help educate the public? And you need to protect Section 230 not only protects platforms from liability for what their users post, but it protects the community's right to both set, to determine and enforce their own rules. So it protects the Wikipedia community's right to decide what is and is not knowledge. There's all sorts of content that Wikipedia community does not deem to qualify as knowledge, which is of course legal, right? But it's not, but it's taken down from Wikipedia pages because it doesn't fit the rigorous standards that the community has determined. And as Jimmy pointed out, not the foundation, the community has determined for different types of subject matter, they have their very specific standards developed by expert volunteers. The people doing COVID-19 information on Wikipedia are doctors and scientists, a large percentage of them. And they've developed their own standards for what constitutes acceptable sources. And their right to do that is protected, and their right to take down poor citations is protected by Section 230. So let's not screw with that. We cannot screw with that lightly. What we need to do is make sure the law protects and encourages more of this type of public interest content and information governance to happen, to enable communities to share quality information in relation to their concerns and problems, rather than drive everyone actually into a smaller and smaller number of well-resourced sites with lots of lawyers. So let's be careful here. And as Jimmy pointed out, and we can talk about more later, there are plenty of other tools in the legal toolbox that have nothing to do with Section 230, that have nothing to do with messing with intermediary liability, free speech, and self-governance protections that governments, that legislators can turn to. Privacy law, for example. Jimmy mentioned antitrust. Among other things, we could require a great deal more transparency across the spectrum, and we can talk more about that later. But again, history is strewn with the wreckage of overcorrection. Let's not, make it even harder for citizens to fight disinformation than it already is.
So thank you so much, Rebecca, for that rousing call and wonderful connection between what happened 10 years ago and today. I want to just mention that Rebecca was the founder of Global Voices, just an incredible community of that really, as someone who tries to learn as much about what's happening outside the United States and Europe as possible. It was one of the best sources for the last 15 years or so. I don't know exactly when it was founded, but
co-founder with Ethan Zuckerman, and
with Ethan Zuckerman,
we'll
yes,
be coming
exactly.
up on our 20th.
20th, okay, so already 20.
In a couple of years. By
yeah. So incredible resource. So thank you, and just another showing of how the internet has allowed voices that we haven't really heard before to be shared across the world. And I also want to note that Rebecca's suggestions about legislative reforms that she liked resounded were very similar to the ones that Ali just mentioned. In fact, they were exactly the same. If I can, so privacy, antitrust, transparency were your kind of main foci for how to proceed. All right, so thank you to everyone thus far. I want to come to Vivek Krishnamurthy. Vivek is the Samuelson Glushko Professor of Law at the University of Ottawa. That's Pam Samuelson, of course, to everyone in the audience, where he directs the Internet Clinic. I think all of us envy that title, by the way, just so you know. Vivek, are you seeing the trends that Ali is identifying in her research in your own work?
As your former student who taught me to provide a short answer at the beginning of an exam, yes, I am. But let me just begin by thanking everyone who put this together, and what a privilege it is to be sharing the virtual podium with you today. yeah, I am seeing these trends, and it concerns me. And I maybe if I could just sort of put a bit of a gloss or a chapeau on what has been discussed so far, I think there are real concerns, right, about different kinds of harms that are occurring online, many of which are perpetuated on large platforms. But the concern I have is that there's kind of an ends justify the means logic here, which is really dangerous. So if we have a powerful kind of harm, shouldn't we use really powerful tools to combat that? And then different societies have different views of what constitutes a harm in different legal systems, right? Some of them are consistent with international human rights obligations, some of them are not. So let's take a concrete example of that, right? And we've discussed throughout the panels or the idea of the diffusion of bad ideas, and SOPA PIPA being, really a bag full of really problematic ideas on internet governance to solve a particular problem, which was seen as a big problem because it costs some companies a lot of money, right? Piracy. So NetzDG, the German network enforcement law, I think is a great example of this, right? So Germany, I think, has legitimate criminal laws that criminalize certain forms of expression that are largely seen as consistent with international human rights norms. That being said, the operationalization of a 24-hour takedown requirement of manifestly illegal content, backed up by large fines, if you get it wrong, it's just a really bad enforcement regime for all of the kinds of incentives it creates, right, towards over removal of content, because you don't want to know. It's hard to tell if it's a borderline, if it's legal or not, where the line is, et cetera. So there's lots of negative, lots of problems with that, which have been well documented, well studied. But the creation of that model in a place like Germany legitimizes its emulation in many other places. Sometimes in democracies, like in Canada, we had a proposal to do that, but often in countries of on the other Freedom House report, the main one, right, Freedom of the World, would do very poorly, right? So places like Poland and Pakistan, emulating the structure of that law, right? So I think what's interesting about this panel, and I've seen this too, is that IP enforcement can be the thin edge of the wedge, right? We've seen this trend happen. So SOPA PIPA obviously was IP focused, and we've seen this in a number of cases in other jurisdictions. Being in Canada, I think about the Equistech versus Google case, right, which was seen as a question of piracy. Selling and advertising pirated products online. That's a economic harm that requires a significant response, worldwide takedowns in our case. And it legitimized, I think, that policy tool in a lot of other places, right? So that, I think, I find it really concerning that democratic countries, right, with strong rule of law traditions that had spent a lot of time lifting up and advocating for a multi-stakeholder, pluralistic model of internet governance seem to have turned their backs on that, right? And there's political pressure, and it's easy to beat up on tech companies. So I find that concerning that we're not walking the walk, as it were, as democratic countries. And I do hope that with the Biden administration's new leadership on some of these issues, that we can sort of see a transition away from that. The other thing I just want to talk about is, Rebecca talked a lot about overcorrection, right? And we had some discussion about, could we rebuild the SOPA PIPA coalition? I think what's interesting about SOPA PIPA 10 years on, right, and also what happened immediately after with the Snowden revelations, right, was that government was seen as a problem, tech was seen as part of the solution, right? And there was this idea of technology companies checking governments. And we've seen that in initiatives like the Global Network Initiative, where there's a premise that large technology companies are going to hold the feet of governments to the fire with regard to domestic due process protections, international human rights respect, et cetera, right? I think we now are living in a different era where there's more skepticism of both sides of this equation, which can be healthy, right? I think Rebecca is quite right to talk about the risk of overcorrection. But to build on what Jimmy and Rebecca were saying, it's where does that leave the people, right? Whose voices are often unrepresented and underrepresented. I just want to share one interesting initiative that I'm involved in here in Canada, which is there's something called the Commission on Democratic Expression happening here, of which I'm a part. But one of the things that has been done as this process is we've convened a citizens assembly, right, of 50 randomly selected people from across the country to sort of listen to experts, listen to different perspectives, and then come up with a series of recommendations as to what the people want. And it's really interesting because it's not so much a let's stick it to the platforms, but we feel disempowered, right? We feel like we're at the mercy of governments, we're not protected adequately, our data is being exploited, and we want protections against these kinds of things that enhance our autonomy, our power, and our ability to be democratic citizens, right? And I think those values, I would love to see those drive the conversation in the next 10 years as we do grapple with some of these really challenging questions of regulation.
Great, thank you, all of you. We have some incredible questions that the audience has posed. And I'm going to begin with my old friend, Edan Katz. So Edan, and our old friend, I'm sure for many in the room, asks, has the evolution of norms towards greater sensitivity to harassment and hate speech since the promulgation of Section 230 changed the dynamic of intermediary liability and the ability for more open engagement in online spaces? And Jimmy, if you'd like to, speak to that, feel free to.
Sure.
Happy to begin with you.
Yeah. So if we step back and look at the the internet as a whole and the current climate as a whole, I'd say definitely so. People have become more aware of the genuine harm that can come from genuine harassment. And that does play into people's concerns about the internet, about Section 230, about what should platforms be doing about this, but not only that, but what should they be required to be doing about this? And I think that's really, really important for us to understand, those of us who think Section 230 is great and see all of the bad reasons that people want to change it so that, hopefully all the good content stays and all the things they don't like goes away, and say, look, there are actually genuine problems and issues. So in the UK, for example, moving away from Section 230 for a second, there's an online safety bill under consideration. And one of the expressions that hopefully they're finally moving away from that they've been talking about is legal but harmful content. Oh, that's a bad expression. That's really hard to say. What are you trying to say? You don't want to make it illegal. You just want to make sure everybody takes it down. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. At the same time, I went to some hearings in Parliament, and I said, look, things like revenge porn, as an example, right? This is a real problem that causes genuine pain and suffering for people, and it's a problem that could be addressed better in the law. It is not clear to me that intermediary liability is exactly the place to look, although we certainly should look at what are the takedown requirements and all of that. But also, how much money are governments investing in actually investigating these things and putting people in jail for doing things that are actually stalking and bad behavior? It's one thing to imagine, we don't actually have to invest law enforcement resources in this. We can just wave our magic wand and Google will make it go away and Facebook will make it go away. That's just not right and not realistic. So, I think that is one of the areas that as we talk about these issues and campaign on these issues, that it's really important for us to be clear to say, look, there are bad things that are happening on the internet that are already actually crimes, but that's not enough just to say, well, it's already illegal. So what are you talking about? It's like they're already illegal, and we as a society, sort of all around the world, aren't doing a great job of, it's like if somebody complains that the number of stabbings is way up in my city, doesn't do any good to say, well, it's already illegal. What can we do? No, it's like, okay, maybe we need to actually invest some resources in finding out the root causes, addressing some of those causes, figuring out how to police it, and so on and so forth. So, yes, it's definitely a real thing.
Great. Any others who'd like to comment on Edan's question about the changing norms around hate speech and the greater recognition of harassment? Rebecca.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think this clearly, speaking to also to what Jimmy was saying and the analogy to a city and security, right? Things evolve over time, and we certainly, I think, everyone who works on internet and human rights has I think evolved in their understanding of how online harassment and hate speech travel on the internet, and what can and should platforms be doing to address those things. And one of the things that in my former role at an organization called Ranking Digital Rights, where we were looking at platform policies, one very important tool is just the commitment to operate in a manner that's consistent with human rights norms, right? And that you're going to be committed to protecting and respecting the rights of everyone on the platform. And in terms of how the platform is designed, how the rules are created and enforced, there's a commitment, not just around free speech rights, but the rights to safety and other rights of people involved and affected by the platform, and responsibilities around that. And that's more soft law rather than hard law, but it's an important, I think, responsibility that anyone who runs a platform has. But it's really hard, right? And this speaks to something that people were talking about earlier, that you can't just magically fix the internet. And speaking to Jimmy's kind of cities and crime analogy, you can't just fix New York City either, right? I mean, Giuliani might say he's fixed it, but other people don't like stop and frisk so much and don't feel that fixes it, right? And so internet policy, as cities evolve, as the internet evolves, where you draw the line is constantly a matter of contestation. And how do we ensure that everyone's rights are being protected and respected while, legitimate harms, crimes are being dealt with appropriately. And it's a whole of society issue, and it's not something you ever solve. You don't fix the internet like you fix the TV. You don't fix the internet just for the same reason you don't fix New York City. And so we need to get used to the idea that this is a constantly evolving, contested thing that we all have to work on together. And when it comes down to it, the issue of governance is, how do we abuse power, and how do we design systems? How do we cultivate a society that actually respects the rights and serves the interests of everyone in it, and enables everyone to participate in its design and governance, right? Brings me back to consent of the networked and consent of the governed, right? And we're in very early days with the internet, figuring out how we do this across digitally networked spaces. But what we need to not apply sort of fix the TV mentality to these problems, but rather think about complex evolving systems that people just need to participate in the design and governance and contestation of forever, as long as we're human.
Thank you, Rebecca. Those are incredibly powerful thoughts. And I think of, New York City as a kind of metaphor for the internet is a wonderful way to think about this, and the evolving kind of structures of governance in New York City, from stop and frisk to kind of the revulsion against stop and frisk later. And Ali, I think, who lives in Brooklyn, would agree that New York City is the best city on earth, right? Despite all of its whatever needs to be fixed in New York City, the good things about New York City still greatly outweigh those bad things. Okay, so let me turn to Larissa Lidsky, who a fellow professor whom I'm sure many of you will know. The point about the Alabama newspaper that Jimmy made, she refers back to that, being inaccessible in London, makes her think about a few issues of the New York Times circulated in Alabama in 62, 63. This is, of course, New York Times v. Sullivan. And yet the New York Times was subject to the largest libel verdict in history because of a handful of subscribers. And so this is the issue that ultimately comes to the court, which says that essentially that you need to have actual malice when you are attacked, when you are a public figure bringing a claim for defamation. And she writes, as the ability to fence off one's content geographically improves even more, might more and more publishers reduce their reach state by state? Might a national newspaper want to keep its content out of Virginia because it lacks a good anti-SLAPP law? SLAPP here, for the non-lawyers in the audience, is the strategic lawsuit against public participation. That is, lawsuits that are designed to harass people who are speaking too much, maybe saying something that is lawful but allegedly harmful, or what Eric Goldman and Daphne Keller called, which I love, lawful but awful. How do we make this new kind of, balkanization, as Jimmy described it, of speech on the internet? Jimmy, would you like to pick up that because it referenced directly? Yeah.
So I mean, it's interesting because I'm so globally minded that I don't think a lot about state by state in the US. That seems a little unlikely, although of course that example, it's entirely possible. And we should recognize that technologically, the ability to target, which has great, wonderful benefits for the advertising industry and great negatives, as we know, is easier than ever. It's quite straightforward, which means that there would be a point in time where if Wikipedia decided, which would be very contrary to us, that we couldn't sort of offer our pages in Germany, that it would have been actually very difficult for us to even begin to figure out how to do that. Now, technologically, it's not that hard. To me, all that says is it means that the danger from legislation is much higher. I mean, it's whenever anybody says, well, if you're in the US, you should follow the laws in Europe if you're going to be broadcasting into Europe. It's sort of like saying Wikipedia should follow the laws of China and censor Wikipedia accordingly if we're showing it in China, which, by the way, is one of the things that a lot of the internet giants do. If certain tweets are under pressure from a government in Turkey, they will maybe not delete the tweet, but they'll make it unavailable in Turkey. So that's just a statement of fact, of technological facts on the ground. For me, that's not reassuring. It just makes it a lot easier and a lot more tempting for governments to go, yeah, actually, Wikipedia, we know full well, and basically we did hear this from Turkey, we know full well you could just block that article and not show it in Turkey, right? If you don't have to take it down everywhere, just don't show it to people in Turkey. Well, we're never going to do that, but a lot of people will. I'm not sure that actually helps answer the question, other than to say, yes, it's lamentably true.
Yeah, I think it's lamentably true. There's no way to have a clean solution to that. Konstantinos.
Yeah, just very quickly, a little bit of a follow-up to what Jimmy was saying. I think that we need to separate a couple of issues here. There is one thing if a company or a newspaper in this case does not want to offer its services via the internet and reach people outside the state limits or what have you. And it's another thing to have a law mandating that this happens. I think that one of the great benefits of the internet and its technology is that it is decentralized. So participation is really up to you. You want to participate, you just, you need to speak IP, you hook yourself into the network and voila, you are part of this global network of networks. But if you have legislation that starts creating those obstacles to either participate or the way you interoperate or interconnect with other networks, then those problems start appearing. And more we are seeing legislation that messes up or attempts to create some issues with the architecture of the internet that do not allow networks to interoperate, or they do not allow global resolution, or they do not allow, or they seek to centralize more and more the functions. And I think that this is a subtle detail that we need to bear in mind, because currently, one of the things that we're seeing is that policymakers believe that technical fixes can actually cure societal problems. And we see that happening more and more. And the terrorism legislation is a very good example. And I think that, Vivek mentioned NetzDG and those unreasonable deadlines of taking down content, which, by the way, are 24 hours, and now they want to cut it down to 12 hours. And there are also, I'm hearing proposals of 8 hours, and they're using these upload filters, right, left, right, and center, and they create all those unintended consequences, and they do not fix the problem. They just create more problems than actually addressing the problem.
Great. Vivek?
Yeah, just on the actual question as proposed by Larissa, I mean, there's also another way of looking at this, right? Which is sort of the age-old question of internet and jurisdiction and whose law applies to what pieces, right? And within the United States, there are ways to try to resolve that more authoritatively, right? So the Supreme Court, has its entire jurisprudence on long-arm jurisdiction, all that stuff, right? Which lawyers get drilled in law school. It's much harder at the international level, right? Because we don't have that kind of centralized authority. We have these principles of when a government has jurisdiction, and they're all contested, right? And some of them sort of are diametrically opposed to each other. And I mean, part of what we need here, and I mean, this is the central difficulty of sort of national, organization of people into geographically bounded states and a global internet, and a phenomenon that is much harder to regulate than, international trade, which is a lower velocity of movement and exchange, right, with more choke points. And, I've sort of thought for a long time about what do we do about this, right? And I don't think it's like an answer that we can say like, oh, this is the solution, right? But we do need to have conversations around what are those appropriate scopes, right? Of when a national authority should intervene and when it needs to coordinate and when it should sort of, say that this is a matter for someone else.
Great. I want to ask another question to the community, to the panelists here. Lucas Ruthus Gonsalves, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name, asks, would the fight against SOPA PIPA be harder if the laws were proposed today? I know that Konstantinos has already spoken on this, and so I want to turn it to Konstantinos first. He spoke on it on Twitter, by the way, so not yeah.
I'm more pessimist certainly than Jimmy is, even though I didn't know the backstory of concerning the copyright directive, but this was a very good example of a SOPA-like activity, because actually there were users that took on the streets in Germany. There were some activists that really tried to put something together, and there were around 1,000 or so people that actually walked the streets and they protested against the copyright directive. But also between then and now, looking at the regulatory landscape, there are a lot of pretty awful legislative proposals that are going around there that could actually do harm to the internet. And the latest and greatest, for me at least, is, again, Jimmy referred to it, the online safety bill, but from all that legislation, there is a bit on encryption that really, truly scares me. And yesterday, the Rolling Stone, the magazine, and The Guardian today and BBC were reporting that the UK government is about to launch a £500,000 campaign where, they're going to show a very creepy side of what can happen in the internet, putting an adult and a kid inside a glass box, and suddenly, the adult stares at the kid and suddenly the glass box goes black and you don't know what happens, in order to demonstrate that If you kill encryption, this will not happen. And encryption, everybody has said it, and more importantly, people much more intelligent than I am, and people who know about cryptography, that it is not only necessary, but is an indispensable component for the internet when it comes to security and privacy. To me, this is really a moment, a SOPA-like moment. And I wish that I could see a lot more coordination and a lot more collaboration as it was happening at the time between all the various groups in order to fight this, because it is misinformed and it is misjudged. And if you put it next to, you know, the immigration laws that the UK is thinking about, then you actually start putting the puzzle together and you realize that this will be a massive tool at the disposal of the government to surveil its people. So I am not so convinced that this can happen. I hope, however, that I am really, truly proven wrong.
So I wanted to come back to Ali, if I could. Ali, you know, you surveyed the countries of the world and, you know, last year. And is there any country that makes you more hopeful about the internet? Should we take heart, for example, in the fact that Twitter is now restored in Nigeria?
Ooh, I love the positive question. I mean, really quickly on what Constantino said, I would echo his concern. I don't know if I'm as optimistic that we would have such a collaborative effort across sectors right now in the same way we did, you know, a decade ago. I think there is a lot more cross engagement or multi-stakeholder engagement, so civil society, private sector working together on maybe smaller issues such as like internet shutdowns in the space. I think there's a lot of movement there, but around regulation, I'm also less optimistic. But looking at sort of a positive example, I always go back to Taiwan. I think, you know, it's a really interesting case study, does really well in Freedom on the Net. We, you know, gets sort of talked a lot with in relation to, you know, what the Chinese government is doing over only around 100 miles or so away. So the government doesn't really impose technical censorship in the way we see in other countries, tends to prioritize sort of transparency in its regulation, doesn't get all the issues right. But I think one of the examples I really like and relates to what we're talking about today has to do with how the country and actors in the country have pursued this multi-stakeholder problem solving and collaboration. So the information space is really bombarded by disinformation campaigns originating from China. And in response, the tech sector, government agencies, and civil society have tried to create really innovative action to push back against this. And I think one of the examples I really like is how the messaging app Line, which is a messaging app pretty popular in South and Southeast Asia, has worked with the country's decentralized civil tech community to create this fact-checking bot. So you can simply, if you're a Line user, you get a message, you're like, I don't know if that's true or not, concerned about it. You can just forward it to this bot and they'll get you information and resources back. So a really easy way to get at some of these, to just ask whether, you know, this information you saw is true or not, and before you forward it to maybe your friends and family. The Nigeria case, I think, is a little, a bit more complicated. So for folks who don't know, Twitter was blocked back in June after the platform removed a post by the country's president saying that it violated the company's abusive behavior policies. So then over the past few months, Twitter's been in negotiation with the government to be unblocked. A deal was agreed upon back in November, but took a while, I think, to get unblocked. So Twitter now has agreed to opening up an office in the capital, registering as a broadcaster, paying taxes, and then committing to take into consideration things like national cohesion and security issues in its content moderation. And I think, you know, what the Twitter case in Nigeria shows is how the government really exploited its role as a gatekeeper to the country's market in an effort to pressure Twitter to, you know, agree to its own terms of operation. So if you're looking at sort of what is the risk of requiring an open to open a local office, which is sort of a provision that we see pop up globally in a lot of the pieces of regulation. So requiring these in-country offices, it really puts company employees sort of in the crosshairs between the state and the private sector. So companies are then sort of incentivized to comply with repressive censorship or surveillance demands, not only to their own sort of financial concerns about, at risk of being cut off from the market, but also to fear over their employees' safety. And that sort of played out back in the early fall in Russia when Google and Apple finally capitulated to the Kremlin's demands to remove a voting app created by a prominent opposition leader there. And the decision came after the government threatened to prosecute local companies. And then sort of the other concern, I think, in the Twitter case is how is this decision or the negotiation going to reverberate around the world? What we've sort of all talked about, I know Vivek picked up on some of these discussions, is how governments learn from each other. So, in the case of Nigeria, I think authorities are watching what happened and that, if we block or restrict platforms, we can coerce companies to do what we want, which we've seen elsewhere, but seen in a country that is not, as authoritarian as China or Vietnam, and more of this like partly free, backsliding democracy is deeply concerning.
Yes, thank you so much. Konstantinos, can you give us, there's a lot happening in Europe, of course. We've heard whether the UK is part of the Europe or not. We've heard about the online safety bill that's being proposed, NetzDG, Vivek has talked about. What's your appraisal of what's going on and kind of, ways forward?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. There is a lot of activity happening in Europe over the past, I would say, 5-6 years. Europe is literally regulating all aspects from internet, from privacy to competition to intermediary liability to AI to cybersecurity, you name it. I think that it is becoming very clear that Europe is marching towards becoming the global de facto internet regulator, and partly that was strategic on behalf of Europe because they really wanted to enter into to have a more leadership role when it came to the internet. And in the beginning, at least, they were lacking the innovation that we were seeing coming out of the United States. So they're testing the grounds, and I think that there is nothing wrong with that. But in that process, there is, a whole spectrum of mistakes that can happen. I think that I can think of three. The first one is really regulating for the sake of regulation, which really currently Europe seems to occasionally be tiptoeing towards saying, okay, I'm just going to regulate because there is an issue and I don't have any other solution to the problem, so I'm just going to throw regulation. And the problem with that is, of course, that you're creating a bureaucratic environment where innovation cannot necessarily flourish, right? And if there is one thing that we know about the internet is that the internet is not a monolith, and regulations have the tendency to be monoliths. So trying to find a balance there is an issue. The second one is sort of like many other countries around the world, Europe occasionally, or in many ways, seems to be making the same mistake of considering that the internet is big tech. Just attach the name. It can be Facebook, Google, Amazon, or whatever. And they're regulating on that basis. And in doing that, you're creating significant issues for sites like Wikipedia and what they're trying to do, and you're taking them down with the ship. And this is not acceptable anymore. We know better. It's 2022. We have 25 plus years of commercial internet experience, and we know what we want to protect and what we don't. Wikipedia, for instance, is not a new endeavor that suddenly popped up and nobody really knows about. It's been literally, it existed long before Google or Facebook, for that matter. Yet again, we seem to forget that detail, and we need to rectify that, and we need to rectify that quickly, because one of the things that we've learned, at least from the GDPR, is that the big companies will survive. The smaller companies will struggle. So, in an effort to not cement the position of big tech, this is essentially what is happening in Europe currently. And the third and last point, it is something that Jimmy sort of alluded to in his introductory remarks, is the extraterritorial effect. Europe did it with the GDPR. It literally shoved it down on everybody's throats, and the GDPR happens to be a good piece of legislation, at least on text, on paper. The more Europe does that, and given the bargaining power that it has, I mean, it's the second biggest trading bloc in the world, right? You can see how this can rattle, rub people the wrong way and other jurisdictions, because, the GDPR happened to be, as I said, good, but cybersecurity or competition or content intermediary liability, and we still, the jury's still not out, but we really need to make sure that there is better coordination when these things happen, because you cannot have one jurisdiction determining what people in Africa, how they will behave in Africa or in Brazil or anywhere else in the world. So it's pretty murky. I think in Europe, the whole environment, I think it's going to get a little bit more intense, because we're hearing about a data governance act and data localization ideas and all the rest. And I am truly, really hoping that there is going to be more collaboration, especially between the United States and Europe when it comes to those issues.
Great, thanks, Konstantinos. Let me turn to Vivek. Are there regulatory moves around the world that you find promising?
Not many, but let me just draw a couple of things. Just to build on what Konstantinos said, I think the recognition that very large platforms present a different set of issues than the internet, right, is a helpful one, and I think we're starting to see that being recognized, certainly in Europe, in the Digital Markets Act and the DSA, right, but also in Washington and other capitals around the world. So I think that's positive, right, that we're dealing with different things. I also think there's a bit more conversation about not just the internet, but it's kind of the entire communication stack, right? And like, what's the role of converged media companies in all of this? So that's a second positive thing, I think. But the third thing, and I think in some ways, the irony of this conversation is that I think companies are now finally starting to do better, in part because of regulation in other places. So one of the revolutionary things the last decade has been sort of the growth of the business and human rights movement, and the idea that companies need to respect human rights and conduct due diligence. And we see national laws being enacted in many places that require companies to do that. And that's changing behavior in large companies, for sure, with regard to many kinds of harms, right? And I wish we could sort of reinforce that move toward greater responsibility. And that's not an internet set of laws. That's a set of laws that applies to all economic actors, right? And improves the environment generally. So I would love us to see it. And we see parts of that, again, in the DMA, the DSA, there are due diligence provisions, right? But I think some of those approaches are promising and give me just a little bit of room to be optimistic about this.
Great, thank you, Vivek. I'm going to close with turning the last word over to Rebecca. Rebecca, what kind of internet are you striving for today? What is your positive vision for the role of the law in shaping the kind of internet we want?
Thanks, Vivek. I mean, people have talked a lot about some of the components of the types of law that would be constructive. I would also point to the need for more transparency and accountability. So I think the purpose of the law and regulation should be to prevent abuse of power, right? And to hold the abuse of power accountable, whether it's by companies or by governments, or and prevent people from using networks to abuse power without being accountable, right? And so we need governments to ensure that the laws are holding them accountable too, right? And we need governments to be more transparent about the demands they're making of companies and nonprofit platforms like ours, both in terms of surveillance and as well as content removal and censorship. We need, effectively, we need people to understand when your information environment is being manipulated or constrained, who is doing it, for what purpose, on whose authority, And is that power legitimate, or is it being abused? And how do we hold it accountable? Right. And similarly, if someone has access to your data, for what purpose? And is that a legitimate purpose? And how do we build mechanisms that provide sufficient oversight against abuse, both by governments and companies and any other private actor? And finally, you know, so we need these free speech and governance protections, you know, for communities, right? So you know, we've talked a lot about why intermediary liability protections, free speech, protect not only free speech, but also the right to self-governance. We need privacy. We need to protect the right to encryption. That's essential for digital civic space or any kind of civic space to survive. And obviously you need access. If you don't have access, if you don't have serious investment into access as a right, we need to address that. We need to be against shutdowns. So, you know, I think there's a way forward. We just need to recognize that everyone needs to be taking responsibility and being held responsible and holding themselves responsible and accountable.
Jimmy, I'm going to come back to you. Would you like to offer a last word? I'm putting you on the spot here.
I mean, I think there's been a consistent theme throughout, which is to state it as in as neutral a way as possible as a Wikipedian. I think the panelists tend to agree that we need to be very thoughtful and very cautious as we move forward with any kind of internet regulation. And then my plea to everyone, not on this panel, because we all are more or less on the same side here, but my plea to the world is, don't break Wikipedia. Like, it's really important, and let's be thoughtful about that. So that's it.
Oh, I think we can all agree with that line. As a researcher, I want to really suggest that. I'm going to. April Doss is going to close us out. So, Executive Director of our Great Tech Center at Georgetown. Thanks, April.
Anupam, thank you so much. And thank you to our esteemed panelists for this terrific discussion. On behalf of the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy and the Global Tech Working Group that is hosted by the Georgetown Tech Institute, thank you all for participating in this discussion today.